The night Margaret died, the rain wouldn't stop. It hammered against the hospital windows like a warning, like a secret begging to be told. I should have felt sorrow. Instead, I felt relief. And then shame for feeling it. But nothing could prepare me for the letter waiting in her locked drawer. The words that would unravel everything I thought I knew about my family, my marriage, and the woman who hated me most. I remember the day my mother-in-law, Margaret, moved into our Brooklyn apartment as if it happened yesterday. The smell of lasagna burned into charcoal is what sticks out most vividly in my mind. The way it seeped into my clothes, the walls, and every last innocent pillow on our couch. Even weeks later, I could catch a whiff of scorched cheese lingering in the kitchen. That was the night that everything came to a head. The judgment, the guilt, the sense that I was failing at everything in my life. But let me start at the beginning, because this story isn't just about burnt lasagna. It's about my heart, my family, and the storm I never saw coming. It all started when James, my husband, decided to help without really consulting me. Margaret had lost her apartment lease back in Ohio after some financial hiccup she refused to talk about, and James insisted she come stay with us for a little while. He came home one evening, sat me down at our wobbly dining table and said, "Mom's going to move in. Just temporarily. She wants to help with the kids, and she needs a place until she finds a better situation." I remember smiling on the outside, but inside my stomach sank. I had known Margaret for years, but our relationship had never been close. She was the kind of woman who believed that if something was broken, you threw it away instead of fixing it. She believed in getting things done quickly, or not at all. I, on the other hand, am a perfectionist who fusses over the details. My life often feels like a puzzle I've carefully curated and painstakingly put together piece by piece. Margaret's approach was a bull in a china shop by comparison, crashing her way from one scenario to another with as much tact as a hurricane. Still, she was James's mother, and she was Lily's grandmother. I had no valid reason to deny her a place to stay, especially when our second bedroom was just being used as my makeshift home office. We could rearrange. We could make it work. At least that's what I told myself. When Margaret arrived, she hauled 2 massive suitcases through our narrow corridor. She dropped them in the living room with a loud thud and took a slow, critical look around. The first words out of her mouth were, "Well, I see Anna still hasn't learned to decorate. This place is as bland as ever." I plastered a half-hearted grin, trying to pretend her remark was just a joke. It didn't take long to see that things were going to be tense. Margaret's arrival interrupted our normal routine. I used to do yoga in the mornings in the living room before Lily woke up. Now I found Margaret already there at 6 a.m., flipping through the morning news channels and sipping tea in her old bathrobe, as if she'd lived with us forever. No more peaceful yoga, no more quiet coffee time. I tried to be patient. I tried to remind myself that she was James's mother and that I should show grace. But every step of the way, I felt judged. She'd glance at the healthy snacks I bought for Lily, organic kale chips, fruit leather from the local co-op, and roll her eyes. She'd comment on how kids need real food, which, in her mind, meant French fries, hamburgers, or processed mac and cheese. On the evening of the burnt lasagna, Margaret's disdain was on full display. I'd come home late from work because I'd been stuck in back-to-back Zoom meetings, and I'd only left the dish in the oven a minute or two longer than necessary. By the time I smelled smoke, it was too late. The cheese crust had turned black, and the edges were smoking. In my haste to pull out the pan, I dropped a ceramic plate on the floor. It shattered into 1,000 pieces at my feet. That's when I heard Margaret's voice behind me, dripping with scorn. 10 years married, and you still can't cook a meal without setting off the smoke alarm. I was too exhausted to argue, so I just stood there, cheeks burning, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes as I tried to breathe through the humiliation. It was in that moment that James rushed in, alarmed by the smoke detector's piercing shriek. He flung open the window to clear the smoke and coughed, waving the air around him. Margaret stood there with her arms crossed, shaking her head as if I were a hopeless case. That night, I could barely sleep. I felt a mix of anger and shame roiling inside me. My own mother had passed away when I was a teenager, so I never really had a maternal figure to watch over me as an adult, someone to share cooking tips with or pass down cherished family recipes. A part of me had hoped that maybe, just maybe, Margaret and I could bond in that mother-daughter way, but that dream dissolved the moment she called my cooking worthless. The following morning, I hoped the tension might cool off, but if anything, it was worse. Margaret was in the kitchen early, rummaging through my carefully stocked pantry. She pulled out anything remotely healthy and set it aside with a sneer, ultimately ordering a pizza for lunch. My 6-year-old daughter, Lily, stood by watching. Later that night, as I tucked Lily into bed, she asked, "Mommy, why does Grandma hate your cooking?" The question stung far more than Margaret's insults. I told Lily that Grandma didn't hate my cooking, that she was just used to different kinds of meals. But Lily's big, inquisitive eyes seemed unconvinced. I lay awake that night, wondering how long Margaret would stay, and whether my marriage could survive her presence. I felt resentment growing in the silent pockets of my heart. James, bless him, was trying to smooth things over, but he often chose to avoid confrontation. He'd say, "You know how Mom is. She just wants to help," which frankly felt like he was dismissing the reality that her help was turning our home into a war zone. A few days later, the conflict reached a new level when Margaret cornered me in the laundry room. I was sorting Lily's clothes, humming softly to myself, trying to think about anything but my mother-in-law. Suddenly, she appeared behind me, brandishing a pair of Lily's untied sneakers like they were evidence in a trial. "You're raising spoiled brats," she hissed. My blood ran cold. I turned around, sock in hand, heart pounding. "Excuse me," I managed to say, my voice shaky with anger. "Lily can't even tie her shoes," Margaret snapped. "She's 6 years old, and you're too busy playing career Barbie to notice." There it was, that jab at my career, as if my desire to work and build a life outside motherhood was a personal affront to her. I felt my jaw tighten. "I'm doing the best I can," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Margaret snorted, folding her arms across her chest. "Your best isn't good enough." I could feel the burn of tears welling up in my eyes, but I refused to let them spill in front of her. I turned away, dropping the sock into the hamper and storming out of the laundry room. That night, I ended up crying in the bathroom. I locked the door and ran the shower at full blast, letting steam fill the air, hoping the hiss of water would drown out my sobs. My phone buzzed on the edge of the sink. It was a text from Kathy, my closest friend since college. She knew Margaret was staying with us and had been checking in on me. Her message vidtro, "Read Psalm 23. Even in the valley, he prepares a table for you." I clutched my phone, tears blurring my vision. The idea of reading scripture in that moment felt both comforting and ironic. Here I was in a valley of sorts, a valley of burned dinners and snide remarks. Did God really prepare a table for me here, in the midst of my mother-in-law's scorn? After I turned off the shower and toweled myself dry, I slid down against the wall. My phone still in hand, I opened my Bible app, because honestly, my physical Bible was buried in a box somewhere, a relic from Sunday school days. I scrolled to Psalm 23, tears still clinging to my eyelashes. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." A bitter laugh escaped my lips. It's not like I was walking through literal death, but the heartbreak and frustration I felt was real. What about the valley of my mother-in-law's judgment? I whispered. Was there an instruction manual in scripture for that kind of valley? Because if there was, I surely needed it. The next day, I decided I'd try a different tactic. Instead of confronting Margaret head-on, I'd attempt to understand her. Maybe that was the key. Some hidden insight into why she was so critical. So, while she was out on an errand, likely buying more real food to replace my organic staples, I went through the kitchen, hoping to tidy up. That's when I found it. A small pill bottle shoved behind the flour canister. At first, I assumed it was something she'd misplaced. I squinted at the label. Xanax, prescribed for chronic anxiety. I stared at the bottle for a long moment, my mind reeling. So Margaret took medication for anxiety. She'd never said anything about it. But then again, she rarely talked about her personal struggles. She was always too busy pointing out everyone else's flaws. But now I had a clue. Something about that discovery softened me, if only slightly. When Margaret returned, I approached her in the living room, my heart pounding. "Margaret," I started, trying to keep my tone neutral. "I found your prescription in the kitchen. It was behind the flour. I'm not sure if you..." She cut me off, her eyes flashing with a mix of fear and anger. "Why were you snooping around my things?" she demanded, taking a step toward me. "I wasn't snooping," I said, holding my hands up. "I was cleaning, and I found the bottle. I wanted to tell you, so you'd know where it was. I'm not judging you, Margaret." She scoffed, but the flash of vulnerability in her eyes gave her away. "You think you're the only one drowning here?" she snapped. "I lost my husband when James was just a boy. He died of a heart attack at 40. For decades, I've been on my own. James is all I have left. And you—" She jabbed a finger in my direction, and I could see tears welling in her eyes. "You act like you've got it all figured out, prancing around with your fancy job and your organic groceries. Like it's so easy." The air between us crackled with tension. My first instinct was to fire back, to defend myself, to say how I certainly didn't have it all figured out. But then I noticed her hand trembling. I saw how tired she looked, the lines under her eyes deep and weary. Maybe this wasn't about me, or about my cooking, or even about Lily. Maybe this was about Margaret and her own pain, her own fear of losing control, or losing the only family she had left. I took a tentative step toward her, swallowing my anger. "I'm sorry you've been feeling alone," I said quietly. "I'm sorry about your husband. I know that must have been hard, raising James all by yourself." She blinked, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. For a moment, it looked like she might let the tears fall, but just as quickly, her expression hardened again. She huffed and turned away, ending the conversation. That evening, I met Kathy for coffee. She was the one who always brought me back to sanity. I poured out the whole story, finding Margaret's Xanax, the confrontation, the revelation about her fear, her loneliness. Kathy, a petite woman with a quiet voice and a fierce spirit, listened intently, her hands cupped around her mocha like she was cradling something precious. "You know," Kathy said gently, "the darkest valleys are where God forces us to see the brokenness in others. It's so easy to think we're the only ones who are hurting. But maybe Margaret's been hurting for a long time. Her anxiety could be a sign of a bigger loneliness or sense of loss." I nodded, taking that in. "I guess I never really thought about what it must be like for her," I admitted. "She lost her husband so young, and she never remarried. She's always been so tough and critical. I never saw her as vulnerable." Kathy smiled sympathetically. "Anna, sometimes the toughest people on the outside have the softest, most wounded hearts on the inside. They put up a wall of judgment to protect themselves from feeling weak." I sighed, looking down at my coffee. That still doesn't make it easier to live with her, though. She's making me feel like a failure in my own home. "I know," Kathy said, reaching out to squeeze my hand. "Nobody's saying you have to excuse her behavior, but maybe you can start showing her compassion in small ways. She might not respond at first, but keep at it. And keep reading Psalm 23. Let it remind you that even in the worst storms, God is with you. He's your shepherd, and he can shepherd your family, even Margaret." I went home feeling a bit lighter, though not entirely sure how to put this new perspective into practice. The next morning was a typical whirlwind of lunches to pack, Lily's hair to braid, and my own corporate emails to skim before I headed out. Margaret hovered in the kitchen, observing me like a scientist might observe a lab rat. I tried to ignore her critical gaze, focusing instead on Lily, who needed help with her shoelaces. "Sweetie, let's practice, okay?" I said, kneeling down to show Lily the bunny ear method. My daughter concentrated, her little tongue sticking out as she looped the lace. In the background, I could feel Margaret stare, but she said nothing. After a minute, Lily managed to tie one shoe. She looked up, beaming. "Great job, Lily," I praised, giving her a quick hug. My eyes darted up to see if Margaret was paying attention. She was, but her face was unreadable. I wondered if she felt a pang of guilt for calling Lily a spoiled brat earlier, or if she was still convinced I was failing as a mother. James had already left for work, which left just the three of us in the apartment. I told Lily to wash her hands, then turned to Margaret, summoning all my courage. "I'm making grilled cheese sandwiches for lunch," I said. "Would you like one?" She shrugged. "Sure, as long as you don't burn them." I fought the urge to roll my eyes. "I promise I'll try not to burn them." I took extra care, making sure the sandwiches toasted evenly. The entire time, I could feel tension radiating from Margaret. Even so, I set a plate in front of her, complete with a side of baby carrots. She eyed the carrots but didn't comment. We ate in silence, Lily chattering about how she wanted to color a picture for Grandma. For a moment, I thought I saw a softness in Margaret's eyes as she listened to Lily. It was fleeting, but it was there. Later that week, after a particularly rough day at work, I came home to find Margaret cleaning the windows. She never asked if I wanted them cleaned, but there she was, scaling a stepladder and spraying Windex like a woman on a mission. My first reaction was annoyance. She was in my space, doing something I didn't even ask her to do. But I remembered Kathy's words about compassion. Maybe this was Margaret's way of helping, in the only way she knew how. I set my bag down and cleared my throat. "Thank you for doing that," I offered, my voice cautious. "The windows look nice." She glanced over her shoulder, her expression surprised. "They were filthy," she said, turning back to her task. I left her to it, heading to the kitchen to start dinner. That night, I went for something foolproof, chicken tacos. I set out all the toppings, lettuce, tomato, cheese, and a side of guacamole. When it was ready, I called Margaret and Lily over. We sat around the table, and I braced myself for Margaret's critique. But all she said was, "These are okay," which, from her, was practically a compliment. Halfway through the meal, Lily got excited about something she'd learned in school, how seeds grow into plants. And she started explaining the entire life cycle of a bean sprout. Margaret actually smiled, shaking her head in amusement. "You're a smart one, aren't you?" she said, ruffling Lily's hair. I felt a pang in my chest. Why couldn't Margaret direct some of that warmth toward me? Days went by in a slow, tense dance. Margaret and I tiptoed around each other, each trying in our own awkward ways to maintain peace. One evening, James mentioned that he was planning to take Lily to the park on Saturday morning. He invited Margaret and me to join them. I hesitated. My Saturdays were usually precious me time. But then I thought, maybe I needed to be part of this. maybe showing up and trying to bond as a family was the right move. So Saturday came, and we all headed to the park. It was a chilly morning, but Lily insisted on wearing her pink hoodie and skipping across the grass, launching herself toward the monkey bars. James and I followed at a comfortable pace, while Margaret lagged behind. I glanced back at her. She wore a heavy coat, her arms folded across her chest. Once Lily was settled on the playground, giggling as she swung from the bars, James nudged me. "Hey, thanks for coming. I know Saturdays are usually your day to decompress." I forced a smile. "We're trying to be a family, right?" I said, before heading to the bench where Margaret had stationed herself like a sentinel. "Would you like to go walk around the pond?" I asked her, trying to keep my tone friendly. She shrugged. "I suppose." We walked in silence at first. The wind rustled the bare branches of the trees, and a flock of pigeons pecked at breadcrumbs on the sidewalk. Margaret seemed distant, her gaze drifting to a couple passing by with their young child. Then, surprising me, she spoke. "I used to take James to a park just like this when he was Lily's age," she said, a note of nostalgia in her voice. "He loved feeding the ducks. We didn't have much money, but I'd always save a few bread crusts for him to throw to them." I looked at her, catching a glimpse of longing in her expression. "You did a good job raising him on your own," I said softly. "He turned out to be a great man." She gave a small, dismissive snort, but I sensed it was more out of habit than genuine cynicism. "He still has room to grow," she said, then gave me a sidelong glance. "He's lucky to have you, I suppose." My eyebrows shot up slightly. That sounded almost like a compliment. We continued walking, the silence between us becoming less charged, more contemplative. I wanted to ask her about her late husband, about how she managed after his death, but I wasn't sure if she was ready to talk about that. We circled back to the playground, where Lily was squealing with delight. I could see James pushing her on the swing. Margaret stopped walking and turned to me. "You're a good mother, Anna," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't say it often, but you are." My eyes widened. An unexpected warmth flooded my chest. "Thank you," I murmured, my throat feeling tight. I wanted to say so much more in that moment. That I was trying. That I knew I had room to grow too. That I appreciated her input when it was constructive. But I just nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. Later that week, Margaret's mood seemed to revert to its old prickly state. She complained about the noise Lily made while playing with her toys, about the cramped space in our apartment, about the way I folded laundry. I felt the anger rising again, and I worried that whatever progress we'd made at the park had been illusory. One evening, I mustered the courage to confront James in private. "We have to figure out a timeline for your mom," I said. "This can't be indefinite. It's not healthy for any of us." James sighed, massaging the back of his neck. "I know, Anna. I've been trying to talk to her about her plans, but she's not being very forthcoming. She says she's looking for a place, but every time I ask, she changes the subject." "Please keep trying," I urged. "I'm reaching my breaking point," He nodded, pulling me into a gentle hug. "I promise," he whispered. I tried to hold on to that promise, but as the days dragged on, I saw no real progress. Margaret stayed just as guarded, and I grew more frustrated. That's when I remembered Kathy's words about Psalm 23, about God preparing a table for us, even in the valley. What did that mean practically? Was it just a poetic notion, or was there something real I could hold on to? One afternoon, while Margaret was out buying groceries, I took Lily out for a mommy-daughter date. We went to a local cafe that had the best hot chocolate. Sitting there, sipping from our mugs, I watched Lily chatter about her dreams of becoming an artist someday. She wanted to paint pictures of princesses and dragons, and told me in great detail about each one. At one point, she looked up at me and said, "Mummy, do you think Grandma loves us?" The question caught me off guard. "Why would you ask that, sweetie?" Lily fidgeted with her cup, looking down at the whipped cream. "She always looks mad. She calls me spoiled sometimes." I felt a pang in my chest. "Grandma's had a hard life," I explained carefully. "She loves you in her own way, but sometimes when people are hurt, they don't show love the way we expect. She lost someone very close to her, and it made her sad for a long time." Lily seemed to think this over, then nodded. "I'm gonna draw her a picture. Maybe it'll make her happy." Tears welled in my eyes. "That's a wonderful idea, baby," I said, leaning over to kiss her forehead. As we finished our drinks, I realized Lily's unconditional love was a lesson in itself. She didn't know all the complexities of adult pain, but she was willing to reach out with empathy. If a 6-year-old could do that, maybe I could too. That evening, I put Lily to bed. She excitedly handed me the drawing she'd done of her and Grandma holding hands, a rainbow arching over their heads. I tiptoed to Margaret's door and left the drawing there, taped to the outside. Below it, I wrote a small note. "We love you, Grandma." Lily and Anna. I wasn't sure how Margaret would react, but the next morning, I found the drawing gone from the door. I checked the trash can in the kitchen, expecting the worst, but it wasn't there. Later, I peeked into Margaret's room when she wasn't around. I saw the drawing propped on her nightstand. My heart softened. Still, the friction between Margaret and me didn't magically disappear. She continued to find fault with things. My time management, the way I parented Lily, the rabbit food I insisted on buying. One evening, I came home to find a whole grocery bag of organic produce on the counter, unopened, while Margaret had cooked a casserole of hamburger meat and cheese. "We need more protein," she said, as if she'd done me a favor. I bit my tongue, trying not to snap at her. Instead, I said, "Thank you for cooking. Looks like you went to a lot of trouble." She seemed taken aback by my polite response. She mumbled something about how someone has to feed this family, then turned away. In the midst of all this, work had become increasingly stressful. My boss had assigned me a new project with an impossible deadline. I was pulling late nights, reviewing financial reports, and building presentations for clients. Sometimes I'd catch Margaret's disapproving glare as I typed away at my laptop, Lily already asleep for the night. One evening, She came into the living room around 10 p.m. "Shouldn't you be in bed?" she asked, her tone accusatory. "I've got a deadline tomorrow," I explained, barely looking up from the screen. She sniffed. "Maybe if you managed your time better, you wouldn't have to stay up so late." My temper flared, and the retort rose to my lips before I could stop it. "Maybe if you managed your own life better, you wouldn't be stuck living with us." The words came out harsher than I intended. Her face went pale, and for a moment I thought she might break down. But she just clenched her jaw and walked out. The guilt hit me immediately. "That was cruel, Anna," I chided myself. I closed my laptop, burying my face in my hands. I thought about Margaret's anxiety medication, about the fact that she'd lost her husband early and was effectively homeless now. Regardless of how she treated me, she didn't deserve that level of coldness from me. The next day, I pulled Kathy aside during my lunch break. She worked at a school nearby, so we often met at a small diner halfway between our jobs. "I can't keep doing this," I confessed, tears brimming in my eyes as I recounted the previous night's altercation. "I feel so guilty for what I said, but I also feel suffocated. It's like no matter what I do, I can't please her." Kathy listened intently, her eyes filled with concern. "You might need to set some boundaries," she said gently. "God calls us to love, but love also includes healthy boundaries. If Margaret is pushing you to the edge, maybe it's time to have a serious talk with James about a definitive timeline for her stay. That doesn't make you a bad Christian or a bad wife or a bad mother." I exhaled, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. "You're right. I need to talk to James again." That night, after Margaret had gone to bed, I sat James down in our bedroom. I explained how I felt constantly under scrutiny, how I couldn't handle the stress on top of work and parenting. "It's too much," I told him, tears shining in my eyes. He looked torn, raking a hand through his hair. "I know, Anna. Mom's never been easy. I've been hoping she'd announce her own plan to leave, but she hasn't. She's my mother. I can't just throw her out." "I don't want to throw her out," I replied softly. "I want to make sure she's taken care of. But maybe we can help her find an apartment in a senior living community, or see if there's a more affordable option back in Ohio with her friends. We can't keep living like this indefinitely." James nodded, reaching for my hand. "Okay. I promise I'll start making calls tomorrow." A few days later, I went into the kitchen to grab a glass of water before bed. To my surprise, Margaret was there, sipping chamomile tea by the dim light of the stove's hood. She looked up as I entered. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she gestured to the kettle. "There's hot water if you want some tea." I nodded, trying to quell the awkwardness. "Thank you," I said, grabbing a mug from the cupboard. She cleared her throat. "Listen," she began, her voice tentative, "about the other night. I know I'm not easy to live with. I'm used to being on my own, doing things my way." I poured water into my mug, heart pounding. "I'm sorry too. I shouldn't have said what I did." She let out a small sigh, a sound that seemed to carry years of burden. You were right in a way. I didn't manage my life very well after my husband died. I tried to be strong for James, but somewhere along the way, I guess I just became angry. Angry that life had taken someone I loved so much, so soon. I cradled my mug in my hands, letting her words sink in. That must have been really hard. She stared into her tea, nodding. It was, still is. We stood there, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. I felt a glimmer of understanding, a glimpse into the pain that fueled her harshness. Margaret, I ventured. James and I want you to be okay. We really do. But we need to find a healthier living arrangement. For all of us, it's not that we don't want you here, but it's complicated. She looked up, and for the first time, I saw sadness rather than anger in her eyes. I know, she whispered. I'm sorry I've made it so hard. I've been afraid to face what comes next. The idea of living alone again after I lost my lease. She swallowed, her voice trembling. I hate feeling helpless. That's understandable, I said gently. We can help you look at options. Places where you might meet people your age, places that could be comfortable for you. She nodded, blinking back tears. That might be best, she said. Then, in a quiet voice, she added, Thank you. From that point on, there was a subtle shift. Margaret was still Margaret, opinionated, often overbearing, but she softened in her approach. She didn't push me out of the kitchen. She didn't insult my cooking quite as viciously. She still made remarks like, "Don't ruin the pot with too much oil," but the biting edge was less pronounced. James began calling different senior living facilities, and we even set up a virtual tour for one in Brooklyn. Margaret resisted at first, but after seeing that it had communal activities, a garden, and a shuttle that took residents on outings, she seemed less resistant. She didn't say she was excited, exactly, but she wasn't shutting the door on the idea either. One afternoon, I found myself alone with Margaret, while Lily was at school and James was at work. Usually, I would have taken the chance to retreat to my office and catch up on emails, but I decided to sit in the living room with her. She was watching an old sitcom, something black and white and full of canned laughter. I sat down and, in a burst of courage, asked, "Would you like me to paint your nails?" Lily's always asking me to paint hers, and I've gotten pretty good at it. She turned to me, a look of surprise crossing her features. "Why would you do that?" I shrugged. "Because sometimes a little pampering can lift the spirits." She seemed hesitant, but after a moment she said, "Well, okay, but no pink. Something more dignified." I smiled. "How about a nice burgundy?" She gave a single nod. I retrieved my nail kit from my room and sat beside her. We didn't speak much, but the act of carefully painting her nails felt intimate. A momentary truce in our ongoing battle. Her hands shook slightly, and I tried to steady them, noticing the faint tremor that likely came from age or anxiety. When I finished, she held her hands up, examining them. "Not bad," she said, sounding almost impressed. "Thank you." "You're welcome," I replied softly. That night, I texted Kathy. "Little miracles are happening." She let me paint her nails. "Progress, right?" Kathy responded with a smiley face and a thumbs up, encouraging me to keep going. I also revisited Psalm 23 that evening, reading it in my Bible app once more. The line, "He restores my soul," jumped out at me. It reminded me that restoration doesn't happen in a single, dramatic moment. It can be slow, subtle, and often happens in the smallest gestures, like painting nails or sharing a cup of tea. A couple of weeks later, we discovered a potential breakthrough for Margaret's living situation. One of the senior communities in Brooklyn had an available apartment. Margaret seemed lukewarm about moving there, but she agreed to visit. The day of the visit, I took time off work to accompany her. We walked through the facility, greeted by friendly staff who showed us the various amenities. A recreational room filled with board games, a small library, a communal dining hall. Margaret didn't say much during the tour, but she asked a few questions about meal plans, guest policies, and the bus schedule. At the end of the visit, the coordinator handed us some paperwork. We sat on a bench outside, overlooking a courtyard where a few older residents tended to a patch of flowers. I turned to Margaret. "It's not a bad place. It's close enough that we can visit often. And Lily could come see you on weekends." She pursed her lips. "I guess it's nice," she said reluctantly. Then she exhaled, her shoulders slumping in a rare display of vulnerability. "It's just hard to accept that this is my next step." I placed a hand on her arm. "Change is scary," I acknowledged. "But you won't be alone. We'll be around if you need anything." She nodded, her gaze fixed on the flowers. "I just hope I can make friends here. I've never been good at that." The honesty in her admission stunned me. I squeezed her arm gently. "You made friends once," I said softly, "with your husband. And you raised James to be a wonderful man who found friends in his adult life, including me. So I think you've got it in you." She gave a small, wistful smile. "Maybe you're right." As the days passed, we began the paperwork to secure Margaret's new apartment. She was set to move in a few weeks. There was still the occasional clash in our home. Old habits died hard after all, but there was also a growing sense of mutual respect. One night, Lily was having trouble sleeping, so I sat by her bed, singing softly to her. Suddenly, Margaret peeked in. She hesitated by the door, then stepped inside. "Do you mind if I try something?" she asked, surprising me. I shook my head. "Go ahead." Margaret sat on the edge of Lily's bed and began humming Amazing Grace. Her voice was low and a bit shaky, but recognizable. Lily's eyes fluttered closed, comforted by the melody. I found myself blinking back tears at the sight of them together. In that moment, I saw a glimpse of who Margaret might have been before life knocked her down. A caring mother, a woman capable of gentleness. On the evening before she moved out, I noticed Margaret's pill bottle on the kitchen counter. She had a set of medication organizers and was carefully counting out doses. I remembered the day I first discovered the Xanax, how shocked I'd been. Now there was no accusation in my mind, only compassion. I cleared my throat. "Are you doing okay with that?" She looked up, her eyes cautious. Then she nodded. "I see a therapist once a month," she admitted. "Have for years now. Sometimes it helps. Sometimes it feels like a waste of time." I pulled out a mug from the cupboard and poured her some hot water. Then I opened a new box of chamomile tea, setting the tea bag in front of her. "Therapy is a process, right?" I said, handing her the tea. "Some days are easier than others." She exhaled, dropping the tea bag into the water. "Right." We stood there in silence, letting the steam curl around our faces. Finally, she spoke. "Anna, thank you for letting me stay here. I'm sure it was difficult for you." My throat tightened. "I'm glad we had this time," I said, realizing I actually meant it. It wasn't easy, but it gave us a chance to understand each other better. She nodded, stirring her tea. "Yes, it did." Margaret moved into her new place the next day. James and I helped her haul suitcases up to her small one-bedroom apartment. Lily tagged along, excitedly announcing that she was going to visit Grandma all the time. Once everything was settled, I helped Margaret organize her kitchen. She had a little kitchenette, enough for basic meals. When it was time to leave, Margaret walked us to the door. She and James embraced, and he murmured something I didn't catch, but I saw tears glistening in her eyes. Then she turned to me. For a second, we just looked at each other. Finally, she opened her arms. Awkwardly, I stepped in for a hug. She squeezed me tight, and I felt her breath hitch. "Thank you," she whispered. Barely audible. I pulled back, my eyes stinging. "We'll see you soon," I managed to say, giving her hand one last squeeze. That night, back in our now quiet apartment, I felt a strange mix of relief and loss. The conflict was gone, yes, but so was the chance for any further daily breakthroughs. Lily was fast asleep, and James was in the shower. I poured myself a glass of water, leaning against the kitchen counter in the stillness of the night. My phone buzzed with a text from Kathy. "How are you feeling?" I typed back, relieved, but also sad. "We made progress, and now she's not here." Kathy replied, "She's still close by. God can continue to restore that relationship over time. You two weathered a storm together. Don't forget that he is your shepherd, and he can still use this season for good." I smiled, setting my phone down. My gaze drifted to the window, where moonlight spilled in through the open blinds. For the first time in weeks, I could hear the gentle hum of the city, without Margaret's voice or presence overshadowing everything. I remembered the final line of Psalm 23. "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life." Slowly, I walked to my bedroom, searching for the journal I kept tucked away in my nightstand. I flipped it open to a blank page, the lamplight illuminating my thoughts. I began to write. The Lord is my shepherd, but sometimes he herds us straight into the storm to teach us how to be someone else's shelter. I never wanted this storm. I certainly never asked for it, but in the midst of mother-in-law chaos, I discovered that even the harshest judgment can hide a wounded soul. And sometimes a shared burden can lead us to the table God prepared all along. I put the pen down, tears gathering at the corners of my eyes. Somehow, in the messy clash of our personalities, God had shown me the brokenness in Margaret and forced me to confront my own impatience and pride. In that valley, my valley of mother-in-law's judgment, I learned about compassion and forgiveness. I learned that Psalm 23 isn't just for the life or death moments, but for the everyday battles that threaten to tear us apart. I closed my journal, turning off the light. As I settled into bed, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. Tomorrow, there would be new challenges. At work, with Lily's endless questions, and yes, with Margaret, who was only a few subway stops away. But for tonight, I allowed myself to rest in the knowledge that I wasn't walking this path alone. There was a shepherd guiding me, even when the valley felt dark and unending. And that, I realized, was the real shelter promised in Psalm 23. A shelter that didn't necessarily remove the storm, but gave me the strength to stand in it, and perhaps, in my own small way, to offer shelter to someone else who needed it just as much.